Did you know in 2017, crime fiction became the UK's best-selling genre? In the Western world, crime fiction accounts for 25 to 40% of all fiction book sales. We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about crime fiction with author Frank Zafiro on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll explore the world of crime fiction with writer Frank Zafiro. But first, a trivia question. Who is the best-selling crime novelist in history? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have Frank Zafiro on the show today. Frank writes gritty crime fiction from both sides of the badge. He was a police officer from 1993 to 2013, holding many different positions and ranks. He retired as a captain. Frank is the author of over 30 novels, most of them crime fiction. In addition to writing, Frank hosts the crime fiction podcast, Wrong Place, Right Crime. He's an avid hockey fan and a tortured guitarist. He currently lives in Redmond, Oregon. When I learned about Frank's unique background, my curiosity was immediately piqued and I wanted to learn more. I hope this interview with Frank will spark your curiosity too. Welcome to the show, Frank. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
What's the most important thing I should know about you?
The most important thing? Wow. I'm a nice guy. How about that? Otherwise, we need to get into specific spheres. What do you need to know of me as a writer or as a friend or as a professional or whatever? That'd probably be different answers.
Well, my husband is from Calgary and he's a Flames fan. So what's your favorite hockey team?
Well, I'm embarrassed to admit it this season because I am a lifelong Philadelphia Flyers fan, and they are one of the worst 5 teams in the league at the moment, inexplicably given their personnel. But my sister-in-law and brother-in-law live up in Calgary, and so I have a soft spot for the Flames there.
And so how did you get to be a fan from a team from Philadelphia?
Yeah, because I lived in Spokane, Washington at the time, and I really didn't come to hockey till I was like 28 years old. So when you come to a sport at that age and you don't have a professional team in your backyard, you kind of cast around for, well, what should I be a fan of? And for a while, I was just a fan of the game. You know, whenever ESPN was playing, I was watching, and that's how I was. But then my oldest son, who was about 5 at the time, was playing the NHL 98 game a lot, the EA Sports game on my computer. And I was too a little bit, but he was playing it a lot. And I would play with him, and he would always be the Flyers for some reason. I should ask why. I don't know the reason, but he was always the Flyers, and he always kicked my butt, which is pretty humbling when you're 28, 29 years old and a 5-year-old is whooping you. But through being beaten up by the 1998 version of the Flyers, I kind of got interested in them, and they got a lot of TV time back then. And so I got familiar with the current version of them. And I really, really liked, it's pretty common throughout hockey anyway, but at the time it was pretty prevalent on that team. I really like that lunch pail approach to the sport, where even your most talented superstars, they're not prima donnas. They block shots, they get out and work in the corners, they take a hit, a good clean hit, and don't whine, and this kind of thing. And I always liked those third line guys that were mucking and grinding, but had some talent too. And so I just fell in love with the team. And as your husband can no doubt attest, once you're in love with the team, every season is like watching a novel unfold before you. There's all these storylines that play out, and it's so much fun to see if this prospect pans out or how this piece of drama happens or how long the coach lasts before he gets fired, or whatever the piece of drama is, there's always something there, and it's fun to watch. And then of course, like anything else, it's fun to cheer your team on.
Well, marrying a Canadian and not coming from a sports family myself, I was a little shocked at how rabid of fans Canadians are with their hockey teams.
I would say it's like football fans and baseball fans on steroids compared to US sports, and it's part of the national identity, in my opinion. And I spent some time in Canada teaching after I retired for about 4 years, and of course, following the game, you pick up a lot of Canadian culture and everything, and it's definitely more deeply ingrained in the Canadian culture, which is part of the reason why I like Canada.
So tell us how your career as a police officer has informed your writing.
Well, that's a pretty easy one. That's a ground ball, if we're going to use it. That's a tap in goal right there, empty netter. Because I write primarily, and especially early on, police procedurals. And for folks that don't know, police procedural is exactly what it sounds like. It's a mystery where a lot of the focus is on the procedures that the police go through in order to discover who the bad guy is or catch a known bad guy that the reader might know who it is already. And so a lot of what I learned on the job translated one to one into that kind of a story. And then all of the nuances, of course, that you pick up. I mean, I was able to write with authority what it was like to, get into a patrol car, check a car into service, what it felt like to wear, a bullet resistant vest on a hot summer night under a wool uniform, and what it's like to get in a foot pursuit after you've been sitting in a car for an hour and a half straight. All of these things that other writers that haven't done it have to use their imagination or research, I already knew. So it kind of gave me a leg up in that department.
Yes, when I had the opportunity a few years ago to go to a police academy for writers, which was a boot camp to learning about the life of a police officer, and it was quite interesting, but I'm sure it's nothing, obviously, compared to your decades of experience doing the job.
Was that Lee Laughlin's thing that you're talking about?
No, it
Oh,
wasn't.
okay.
No.
A lot of departments do what they call a citizens academy, which is pretty cool. And, it goes on for 8, 10, 12 weeks, once a week. And folks that go through that, get I think a really good picture of the way things are. I mean, they don't get the depth of it. They don't get all the nuances, but they'll never think of a traffic stop the same way again after they've been through that experience.
So your storytelling creed is the good guys usually win, but not always and never without a cost. Tell us more about that.
Well, when I started writing crime fiction, I didn't want to write, you know, cookie cutter fairy tales where Dudley Do Right, wins every time, and it's predictable, and the villains have no depth, and this sort of thing. And I also had a mind toward, even in the early books, toward showing the humanity of the police, the police officers, because like with any group of people, I think sometimes people look at a police officer, they see a badge or a uniform, or a gun or all three, and they don't really see the person behind it, or recognize that they are a person, just because they're more of a symbol to the viewer. And so I wanted to write books where you got to know the cops as people. But it would be propaganda if every one of those people were perfect in every way and succeeded at everything. And, I was a cop for 20 years. I spent the first half of that working the street in various capacities as a, line officer. And I didn't win every battle. I mean, I won every fight eventually, but I didn't win every battle. I didn't catch everybody I chased. I didn't find everybody I was looking for. I didn't get enough evidence to arrest every person that I knew did something. I lost sometimes, and I screwed up sometimes. I could tell some stories on myself where they're very embarrassing. And so that was kind of what I wanted to include in the writing. I wanted it to be more realistic in that sense. but I wanted it to be pro police because I was one. And quite frankly, the experience that I had as being part of the profession, both at my agency and then later on when I was teaching all across the US and Canada, within the profession as a whole, my experience was that almost every cop I knew was a hardworking person who was dedicated, who believed in what they were doing, and were trying to do the best job they possibly could. And so I wanted to also kind of show that dedication and nobility, even if it was a flawed person who was exhibiting those particular traits. And so the good guys need to win most of the time, I think, in books like this, but not always. In fact, in the second book, spoiler alert, but in the second book, a lot of people lose in a lot of ways. And never without a price, even when they do win, because that's life, isn't it? I mean, very, very seldom do romp through to and cruise to an easy victory in life. Usually you pay a cost in either effort or sacrifice or learning from failure before you're able to succeed. And so I wanted to represent that as well.
Yeah, and I think an easy victory would make a boring book.
Yeah, I mean, books are all about conflict of some sort, right? And so you're absolutely correct. I think they would be very boring. I mean, bad guy did something, cop came along and caught him, the end. I mean, who's going to read that story?
It's like 5 pages long.
It's going to get a lot of 1-star reviews as well.
What author has influenced you the most?
That's a tough one because I'm 53 years old and I've read a lot, and I've spent some of that time as an author myself. And so I mean, I'd have to give a couple of names to make that one a true answer. I think early on, I did a lot of science fiction and fantasy reading. And so one of the early writers that really influenced me in a way was a science fiction and fantasy writer named Piers Anthony, who wrote very eclectically. He wrote some very lighthearted stuff and some very gritty stuff. And the fact that he could do both was pretty cool, because I can't, not to the degree of flexibility that he has anyway. And also because I was like 13 years old and I sent the guy a letter, and he wrote back like 3 times over the course of a few years, and that's pretty heady when you're a 13-year-old kid and you get a letter back. I mean, it was a 3x5 card with typing on the back, and as a postcard basically, with strikeouts where he made mistakes and everything, but it was full. The whole back of it was full, and it was personalized and real. And it made an impression on me that, hey, this is just a person. And that's a pretty cool way to be, to treat your fans that way. Later on, when I got closer to becoming published and writing crime fiction, which I really didn't start writing until about 2004. You can't write crime fiction and as a police officer and not credit the influence of Joseph Wambaugh, because he was the pioneer of that. And so his early books especially were an influence. But you can't try to emulate your influences either, otherwise you just become a pale imitation. And then I guess the other one I would mention is probably pretty common, but it's still true. I think Stephen King's been a really big influence, simply because he's always come across as a regular guy who works hard, who tells the stories he wants to tell. And his book on writing is fabulous, and it has a lot of truths in it, and it's very accessible. And his story about failure and keeping at it, and it's so inspiring. And that kept me at it at times when, my thumbtack had become a nail, had become a railroad spike of rejections hanging from it. That kind of inspiration to not quit is invaluable.
Well, and his wife fishing his first novel out of the trash.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously that tells you something about relationships too, how important it is to have somebody who believes in you, so that even when you lose perspective, they're there to say, no, you do have talent. No, you are a good writer. Don't quit. And this is actually pretty good. And now go sell it and, make $500,000.
So have you tried your hand at science fiction, since that was such an early influence for you?
Very little. early on when I was younger, before I became a police officer, because I've been writing since I was about 10. So, in those earlier years up until my early 20s, I did. And I never got to the point where I felt like my science fiction was original enough to be good. I did recently write a near future story for an anthology that's coming out shortly. Um, the story is called The Last Cop, and it's a near to mid future setting when there's been a lot of social changes and so forth. And he's the last remaining police officer. And so that's certainly science fiction, kind of social science fiction. But that's probably the most sci-fi thing I think I've written.
Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, I loved it. It was, interestingly enough, at least it's interesting to me. The idea for that story has been sitting on my hard drive since 2007, and it's just never quite had the catalyst to have me sit down and write the story. I mean, I had like the opening scene and a synopsis notes for myself, and I just never was, never quite pushed to it, and then this opportunity came along, and I was like, you know what, now's the time for that. And then I pulled it out, and by then I had some ideas to add to it. And yeah, I really did enjoy it.
Well, I'll look forward to reading that one. So, what do you find most challenging about writing crime fiction?
I think just trying to keep it fresh. I mean, there's only so many crimes people can do. And there's been a lot of people writing about those crimes. And so, how do you keep it fresh? How do you keep, without being ridiculous, hey, this time he's going to rob a bank, but his partner's going to be an alien. And I mean, how do you do it in a way that feels organic, that feels real? And that can be a challenge. But honestly, I think that when people read these stories, they care about the story, clearly, but they really want to know and care about the characters and their interactions. And so I think if you focus on that, there can be similarities between the types of crimes that are going on in your stories. And I don't think, I mean, how many murder mysteries are there out there, right? People are still reading murder mysteries, but they're reading the murder mysteries primarily, I think, because they care about the people doing the investigations, those characters. And so that's kind of how I try to keep it fresh.
Yes, I've been myself. I've been following Harry Bosch now for, I don't
Perfect
know,
example.
25 years.
Yeah, and if you broke down a synopsis of every one of his cases, I bet you could start to point to two that are very similar to each other. Well, these are both bank robbers, or these are both what rapists, or I mean, it's there's only so many ways people can commit crimes, and rather than try to be super ingenious, but in this case, they did this. No, how about let's care about the characters and what they're going through, and that seems to be the key to me anyway.
So, what advice do you have for people who would like to write a book, but maybe they're afraid or aren't sure where to start?
Yeah, it's the same advice about anything that you're afraid of. I mean, it's that old Nike just do it sort of thing. Um, and I don't mean do it. I don't know what the rating is on this show, so I'll be careful. But I mean, I don't mean do it half-assed, if I can say that. But uh, but doing it, and part of that is obviously doing your homework, going to school on what that encompasses. If you want to, I mean, I wanted to learn how to play the guitar a long time ago, and I had no musical ability and no musical knowledge and nobody to take lessons from. So it was a rocky road for sure. But I still picked it up. I still learned some chords. I still tried to learn how to strum, and learned those, foundational pieces as time went on. And then I got lucky and had an instructor briefly, and then YouTube came along, and my gosh, that's a great for self learners. And I'm still horrible. My wife is probably the only person. My wife and my daughter both listen to me, and that's because they're wonderful, saintly people. I would never claim to be good at it, but I am better than I was, and I do love it. And I'm glad that I continued to do it. But I didn't just pick it up and look at it for 12 years and hope I would someday be able to play a song. And I think sometimes people do that with writing, because it's, we quote unquote write in our daily life, but we don't creatively write. And so putting in the hours, doing the important things, read, and then learn to write and learn to revise and learn how to take criticism and what criticism to listen to, and what criticism not to. and doing it consistently, not just writing when the whim takes you, like, like there's a muse and I can't write if the muse isn't on my shoulder. That's not, no, that's not the case. So you have to be persistent and you have to want to do it. But it's not magic any more than playing a guitar is magic. I mean, I'm never going to be in a band, and maybe you'll never write well enough to for somebody to, option your book as a movie or something, but you'll still get to do what you love and you'll still get to get better at it. You just have to be willing to do those things.
That's great advice. Tell us about your podcast, Wrong Place, Right Crime.
It is a podcast that focuses on mystery writers, crime fiction authors. It's been around since 2017. Initially, it was a monthly podcast that went about an hour, and I started it after a buddy of mine, in fact, one of my co-authors, Eric Beatner, and another guy, Steve Loudon, started a great podcast called Writer Types. And I just, it was so much fun that they were having, and it was so cool to talk to the authors like they were and everything. And I wanted to do it as well, but they're funny, and their show was kind of like an AM morning drive radio show, with the three hosts cutting it up in little short snippets and things like that. And I could never outdo that, by myself. I would want to try to. So I kind of went the other direction with this. It's, late at night, rainy night, you turn on the radio and two people are talking and you don't even know what the subject is because they're talking about horses, and then you realize the guy is a musician that's being interviewed or something, and they range far and wide and always come back kind of to the topic at hand, but it's pretty freewheeling and more of a deeper dive. And that's exactly what I did. And it was great for about a year. But I was having to say no to so many interview requests that I had to make it a weekly show, but I couldn't do an hour a week. It was too much. So I made the non-feature episode monthly episodes, the weekly ones, essentially open and shut episodes that run about 10 to 20 minutes. And that allowed me to talk to a lot more people and promote a lot more people, but not get bogged down by the editing process, which, as you well know, every minute on the mic is 2, 3, 4 minutes, at the editing software. So that's what was kind of motivating that. So now it's a weekly show. So about 144 episodes now. And I've interviewed big names, Walter Mosley, Steve Hamilton, Christopher Moore was a really fun interview. But I also interview, people that are kind of at the stature that I'm at, that middling, where only crime fiction authors of a certain kind or readers of a certain stripe know who you are, and brand new authors as well that are just coming out with their first book. And I try to stick to mystery authors for the most part, but that's a pretty loose definition. And I've had an editor and blog reviewer and a couple of super readers, I mean, to mix it up a little bit.
So if you could interview one person, living or dead, who would be your dream guest for your podcast?
For my podcast, I'd want to interview Stephen King, I think, because it would be a great fit for the podcast, and I think it would be pretty inspirational for people. And I've actually tried. I actually was having about a once every 6-month conversation with his assistant, and being told every 6 months that he's not doing a lot of interviews, but you can check back. So I checked back, and I got all along with Marcia quite well. And then she retired, and whoever took over for her asked me what organization I was with. And when they heard I was with a niche podcast, I haven't heard back since. So I don't think that interview is going to happen.
Never say never.
Well, maybe he'll hear this and be like, you know what? It would be a very Stephen King thing to do, to drop in on a tiny little podcast like that. That would be some really Kingish things to do. So maybe so.
So what new projects are you most excited about?
Well, in addition to all the crime fiction I'm working on and all the different series that I have, So I'm always excited about the next installment of those, the next River City novel, the next Copriva, the next Spokompton. But later in the year, I'm also going to kind of go back to my roots a little bit, if you will, and start a fantasy series under a pen name. And so I'm pretty excited about that because it's just so different. I'm always excited for every new book because it's a story untold and I get to discover it first. So that's really cool. But moving into the genre that I read growing up and getting to write something like that is pretty exciting.
And is there anything else you'd like to tell us about you or your work?
Well, just that it's honest storytelling. I mean, I don't pull punches, and I try to show it as much as it is as possible. Some of the series are darker and grittier, like the Spokompton series. So the way that it is in that world is a little darker than, say, in the River City universe. But it's all fair and honest and very blue collar, I guess.
And where can listeners find out more about you?
Oh, the easiest place would be my website, frankzafiro.com. And Zafiro is Zafiro. And of course, I'm on all the social media platforms.
It was great to have you on the show, Frank. Thank you so much for taking time to be a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
Thanks for being curious about me.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. Who is the best-selling crime novelist in history? Outsold by only the Bible and Shakespeare, Agatha Christie is the best-selling novelist of all time with over 2 billion copies of her books sold. She is best known for her 66 detective novels and 14 short story collections, as well as the world's longest-running play, The Mousetrap. We'll end the show with something punny. 2 criminals stole a calendar. They each got 6 months. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.